France is going to be intensifying its laws restricting the Islamic religion. Remember the hijab ban that came up back in the early 2010s. Remember the conservatives were saying, "Oh, look, France is the only country that's heroic and that's courageous, while America just, cucks itself to the Muslims and to Sharia." While those Frenchies over there who, just wave the white flag all the time, they're the ones fighting against the Islamic religion. Well, the French government announced that it's going to be extending that hijab ban, and the hijab ban isn't really like it's not like you can't wear the headscarf. In France, you can wear the headscarf. You just can't wear a hijab that covers your face. But still, this is something that is very offensive to a lot of Muslim people. Another thing that France is going to be enacting is a law that prohibits the hijab to be worn in university grounds and university property. You can't wear the hijab in a university. Also, if kids are going on a field trip somewhere and their parents are with them, and the parents are Muslim, they can't wear the mothers can't wear the hijab. That's going to be banned. So they're going to be enforcing these rules, and this is about French republicanism. This is not about fighting against the evils of Islam and Sharia. This is about enforcing the ideology of republicanism, and the French government has made this very clear that this is about making sure that citizens remain loyal to the ideals of republicanism that go all the way back to the Enlightenment and that first manifested itself in the French Revolution. And the French Revolution was all about republicanism and replacing the monarchy with a republic. America is a republic. We are a democratic republic, but at the same time, we were not founded on the anti-Christian ideology of Voltaire and Rousseau. France was. France was founded on those ideas that were vehemently anti-Christianity, anti-religion, anti-God, and it was really an ideology that wanted to wipe out any sort of Christian influence in the French government. This was a very radical, a very fanatical movement that gained a lot of power in France. So people may read this news and think, wow, look, the Frenchies are really getting it down. They're really going hard on the Muslims. This is great. You have to be very wary. Now, I am a big proponent of the idea of paying attention to a country's history. I think this is absolutely essential. Like, you have to look at a country's history in order to have a better understanding as to what it is doing currently. And you also get a better idea of that particular country's future. So when the French government is talking about making sure that citizens are loyal to the ideas of republicanism, that citizens will be, compliant to the ideals of French republicanism. We have to go back and look at how that ideology manifested itself. It manifested itself in bloodshed. It manifested itself in the slaughter of innocent people. It manifested itself in the guillotine. It manifested itself in the pursuit of destroying Christianity in France. It's much like the anti-clericalism that popped up in Mexico in the 1900s, in the first half of the 20th century, in which Plutarco Elias Calles, the Mexican dictator, literally tried to wipe the Catholic Church out in Mexico. And they almost did it, and they were a Freemasonic government. But if it weren't for the Cristeros, who actually took up arms and fought for their faith in the battlefield, the Masonic government in Mexico probably would have succeeded in its aspiration of destroying Christianity. So I'm a big believer in looking at a country's history. When I hear people telling me things like, well, India is going to take over the world, I think those people are vacuous of the reality of how a country's history affects its future. India has never had a world empire. So yeah, I'm not really worried about India. Germany, on the other hand, has had a history of being an empire. And so Germany still has the most powerful economy in Europe, and thus it has the capacity to becoming a world empire again. Japan, the same thing. The British, the same thing. The Turks, the same thing. Now, with the French, we know that the Frenchies have a history of murdering people because they believe in Jesus. We saw this in the French Revolution. Nuns were being raped. If a woman wanted to go to church, gangs would beat her up. There were cases where there was some pretty vitriolic mockery of the Christian faith. I think it was Louis Saint Just who took it. It was one of those anti-Christian ideologues in the French Revolution. I think it was Saint Just. He put a donkey on the road and had the donkey dressed up like a priest and had the donkey walk, and the donkey was dragging a copy of the Gospels and a copy of a Roman Missal. This was a reflection of how much anti-Christianity was filling up the political atmosphere of France at the time. So France definitely has this history. So when I hear about the French government putting in place laws restricting the Islamic religion, you can say, well, they're trying to combat terrorism, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, okay, fine. They're trying to combat terrorism. But at the same time, we have to look at the bigger picture. Why is Macron doing this? Macron is doing this as a way to counteract the rise of the right wing. Not necessarily because he is concerned about the violent ideology of the French New Right, but because the French New Right and the right-wing party of people like Marine Le Pen, they are a threat to his party. It's like the Democrats versus the Republicans. And the populists of France, they want to see more laws restricting the Islamic religion. And this has a lot to do with what happened with Charlie Hebdo. And then you had the teacher in France who was beheaded. And then somebody else was beheaded, if I'm not mistaken. There was that priest who was beheaded. The Islamic fundamentalists, they pose a big problem in French society. I'm not going to deny that. So the French populace is very angry, and there is a very strong chance that the French populace will have a shift towards the right. I mean, there's already a very strong shift towards the right in France, but there is a possibility, there is a strong prospect that the shift to the right may be big enough to defeat Macron's party in an election. If you look at recent polls that were done in France, the popularity of the right versus the popularity of Macron's party is about 48-51 in favor of Macron. But still, 48% of France favors Le Pen, and that's huge. So, it only takes a couple of percentage points to change the result of an election. It's like the Republicans versus the Democrats. The Republicans and the Democrats, they're not really worried about gaining 48% of the population, or maybe 45% of the population. They already have those people. They're fixated on getting 5% of a population. They're interested in getting 5% of their opposing side's party. If they can, so for example, if the Democrat Party can get 5% of Republicans to vote for them, then the Democrats can beat the GOP. Vice versa, the same thing. If the GOP can get 5% of Democrats to vote for them, then they can defeat the Democrats. It's all about that that short margin of the population that you want to get. It's the same thing in France. So Macron is trying to appeal to an angry populace, a populace that is upset with the rise of Islamic fundamentalism and jihadism. And so he is appealing to that crowd with the fear that if he doesn't, they are going to vote for Le Pen. So Macron is being dictated by the far right in France. Now you can say, well, this is a good thing. The far right is great. People should vote for the right wing in France. Le Pen should be the leader of France because she is the present day Joan of Arc, and she's a saint. And maybe she should be elected to be the next pope or something like that. But we have to consider something very important here, and that is one thing that Le Pen wants to do in France. She's actually worse than Macron. People talk about Macron and they're like, oh, he's a Freemason. Oh, he's part of the elites. Le Pen is an outsider. Le Pen is worse than Macron. And here is why. Because while Macron will do certain restrictions on the hijab, and he'll do certain restrictions on Islamic organizations. For example, part of this new law is that Islamic organizations have to sign a document essentially saying that they are loyal to the republican ideals of the French state, of the French society. So while Macron will enact measures such as that, Le Pen wants to literally abolish all religious apparel in public. So Macron targets the hijab, and not just the hijab in general, but it's just the face covering hijab. Women can still wear the general headscarf of Islamic society. They just can't cover their faces, which is understandable. But at the same time, these things can escalate into something worse. Who knows? Le Pen wants to ban nuns from wearing their habits in public, priests from wearing their priestly garbs in public. She wants to ban Jews from wearing the yarmulke, the kippah, in public. And she herself has said this. If you don't believe me, you can look it up. And I've talked about this several times on my videos and in articles. Le Pen is actually she actually upholds the ideals of the French Revolution more so than Macron does. Now, I've said this many times. The French Revolution, while technically it was left-wing, the French Revolution had very strong nationalist fanaticism. For example, when the French had a civil war between those who wanted a king and those who wanted no king, the ones who wanted no king and they wanted a republic, they called themselves patriots. The people who supported the king and they supported monarchy, they called themselves royalists, not patriots. So there was nationalism that went on. You have the French ideologue Bertrand Barrère. I think I'm pronouncing that last name correctly. And Barrère said that every child in France, once he or she is born, should be consecrated to the state instead of being baptized in the Catholic Church. So they wanted to replace the Catholic Church with a nationalistic religion of the state. This is one of the things that Robespierre wanted. He wanted a civic religion. And there was actually a little war that went on between the different factions of the French Revolution. So, for example, you had the Dantonists, and you had the Girondists, and these were people who were more in favor towards atheism. They were more in favor towards a cult of reason. And then you had the Robespierre faction, and that was more so for a civic religion. And you had two different religious organizations that popped up in the French Revolution. You had the cult of reason, and then you had the worship of the goddess of, was it the goddess of reason or the goddess of liberty, I believe. And they had their rituals, they had their feasts, they had orgies. They made the Cathedral of Notre Dame into a temple to the goddess of reason. And it was a complete religious takeover of France, which really flies into the face of the typical very, very brittle argument that leftists love to use all the time, and that is, well, if we just got rid of religion, well, you're not going to get rid of religion because people are naturally religious and they have natural religious devotion. And so the French Revolution wanted to remove all Christianity. And the idealists of the French Revolution wanted this. That's what they wanted. They wanted to either replace Christianity with the religion of rationalism or the worship of a goddess. They wanted paganism. So that's what Le Pen is. She is an embodiment. She is a product of the French Revolution. And France is still, to a great extent, a product of the French Revolution. This is why there is a huge movement in France that wants to continue to restrict religious liberty. Hence, these rules against some aspects of the Islamic religion. So there's another thing that I wanted to bring up, and that is the French New Right. If you look at the French New Right, and Le Pen she is really a product of this movement. The French New Right was something that popped up, I want to say, in the 1970s. It was essentially Nazism, um, covered up with as patriotism, or covered up as French conservatism. But it was far from anything that Americans would consider conservatism. There were homosexuals in this movement. There still is. They had pedophiles, or people who belittled the seriousness of pedophilia. You had people who were involved, or who people who pushed the ideology of homoeroticism. They have eugenics in this movement. They have racism in this movement. The French New Right was a monstrous, demonic, evil movement, and it was also very anti-Catholic. And it was really another product of the French Revolution. The ideologues of the French New Right were people like Guillaume Faye, Renaud Camus, people like numerous other ones. I don't remember all their names. But Marine Le Pen's father, Jean Le Pen, he was really a part of this sort of circle. That's why, for example, he went to Ukraine and he hung out with Ukrainian Nazis. So the way I look at it is like this: the French New Right is like if you look at the French Revolution, you have the Diderots, you had the Rousseaus, you had the Voltaires, you had these ideologues that wanted to destroy religion. At the same time, these people wanted revolution against the establishment. If you look at the French New Right and the far right in France, these people are essentially the same thing. These are rebels. Now, they may want to get rid of the current condition of the republic and replace it with something else, but at the same time, they are rebels against the establishment. They want to destroy the status quo and replace it with something else. They remind me of the French satanic and national socialist heavy metal band Peste Noire. This band, they make songs about destroying the republic and replacing it with an elitist aristocracy. And I think that this is simply a continuation of the spirit of rebellion. Just because some of these rightists may not want a republic doesn't mean they're not a part of the legacy of the French Revolution. Because if you look at the history of France, you find that there has always been this continual struggle between the state and the populace. And it many times erupted into horrific violence. For example, I want to say in the 14th century, there was a revolution. There were a number of revolutions in France, actually, that took place before the French Revolution. In the 1500s, I believe there was a revolution in one part of France. I don't remember, but in the late Middle Ages, there was a guy by the name of Etienne Marcel, and he actually started a revolution against the king. I believe the king's name was Charles Dauphine, and Etienne Marcel believed that the monarchy should have less power than the estates, and that the estates should basically usurp the power of the king. He one day rallied up a mob of around 3,000 people, and he murdered the king's two marshals right in front of the king's eyes. Eventually, Etienne Marcel was gotten rid of, and the revolution was squashed. But nonetheless, it was really an example of how this spirit of rebellion was in France for quite some time. So this spirit of rebellion is still in France. It's still in France. But I think it is manifesting itself in a slightly different manner. While the French Revolution was heavily nationalistic, this spirit, this form of rebellion in France today is also very nationalistic. It's racialist, and it wants to remove the status quo. And people could argue and say, well, that would be, against the Great Republic of the French Revolution. So these people aren't a part of the legacy of the French Revolution. But the fact is that they're part of that legacy of the spirit of rebellion, which is alive and well in France. Sorry, I'm a little bit stuttery today. So anyway, yeah, those are my thoughts on that. The way I look at it is that the French New Right, they're basically the Robespierres, the Voltaires, and the Rousseaus of France today. They want to cause a political revolution. They're very dangerous, and the fact that Macron did these laws in order to appeal to the right wing really indicates that the right wing is on the rise. It's very influential. It's powerful. And if Le Pen gets in office, she may escalate the law against the hijab towards Christians and Jews. So don't start automatically praising France for this, because it may escalate into open anti-Christianity and anti-Judaism. This is why I'm against this. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.